This video cassette will show you the proper procedures for disassembling and reassembling the Osborne executive computer. If you actually do disassemble and assemble the computer while you're watching this program, you'll get more from it. Pause your video player at each point where you need to leave the tape to work on the computer, or rewind and review a section as you go along. It might be helpful to zero your video player's counter at the beginning. Then you can mark down the counter numbers at the start of each chapter. Later, when you have a question about procedure, you can fast forward quickly to the section you need to review. The Osborne Executive has been designed in a modular manner. There are 7 sub-assemblies which make up the computer. These sub-assemblies are the keyboard, the bezel and main chassis, the logic board, which consists of the CPU board and a piggyback RAM board, the video monitor and power supply, the disk drives, the power switch, and the fan. Because of manufacturing requirements, there is a definite order in which you should disassemble and reassemble this computer. If you follow these procedures and this order, you'll be able to work on or replace the specific module you may be after in a matter of minutes. Before we get into the specific procedures, though, we'll give you an overview of the order so you'll be better oriented. The removable keyboard, of course, can be serviced without getting into the main computer chassis. The only other module which can have some service work performed without removing the carrying case is the power switch for bulb replacement. The other 5 modules can be serviced by first removing the bezel and carrying case, then proceeding in the following order. First, the fan assembly can be serviced. Then the logic board must be removed before you can remove the video monitor and power supply assembly. The disk drives can be removed either before or after the logic board and the video monitor subassemblies are disassembled. We'll now show you the recommended procedures for disassembly of the Osborne Executive. Each step will be carefully explained, and you'll see close-ups of important details. And of course, always be sure the computer is disconnected from a power source. Following the disassembly procedures, we'll cover the steps necessary to put it all back together again. On other Osborne tapes, you can find step-by-step procedures to properly align the video monitor and the disk drives. You'll need these tools to completely disassemble and assemble the Osborne Executive: a 5 or 6-inch Phillips screwdriver, a standard flat blade screwdriver, a 1/4-inch nut driver, and an 1/8-inch nut driver. This section will show you how to disassemble the keyboard. Find the keyboard cable. As you face the monitor screen, it's the cable connected to the keyboard unit from the left. Disconnect the keyboard cable from the front of the computer by carefully spreading the latches on the chassis connector and holding the plug firmly as you pull it out. Using a pad or a soft material to protect the keyboard, turn the case over so the keys face down. Notice here we're working on a carpeted bench. Remove the 632 Phillips screws located on the underside of the keyboard case. You can leave the screws in the holes in the case. It'll keep them where you'll need them later when you reassemble. Lift the keyboard case from the keyboard and bezel assembly. Notice the ground lug connector that's held down with a 632 Phillips screw. Remove this lug. Carefully remove the keyboard harness from the keyboard connector. One word of caution: always be sure you check the proper orientation of any connectors you may have to detach. When you reassemble, they'll have to be put back exactly as they were originally installed. If you're in doubt, make a small diagram for your own use later. Notice that the keyboard harness is aligned with pin 1 of the keyboard connector. As you look at the underside of the keyboard, pin 1 is the upper right pin. It may also have a dot next to it on some keyboards. If it doesn't have a dot, it'll be helpful during reassembly to mark the location of pin 1 with a felt-tipped pin on the connector and the board itself. Remove the 3 remaining 832 Phillips screws which secure the keyboard to the bezel standoffs. Lift the key switch array from the keyboard bezel. Be very careful with the ribbon cables on the keyboard. Any pressure on these cables could lead to an intermittent connection. Remove the harness cable and set it aside. This section will show you how to disassemble the bezel and the chassis. You'll need to do this procedure whenever it's necessary to troubleshoot or replace any components inside of the computer itself. Again, be sure the computer is not connected to any power source. Be sure that you remove any other external connectors, such as a modem or a video cable, at this time. The video contrast and brightness knobs are the press-on type. Pull them off their shafts. There are 5 6/32 by 1/4 inch Phillips screws surrounding the bezel. Remove these screws. Take hold of the edge of the bezel near the carrying case latches and carefully pull the bezel straight forward away from the case until it's free. Be careful whenever you're sliding the bezel in or out of the case. There's a special metallic paint that's used for shielding on the inside of the bezel, and it can be easily scratched. Carefully turn the computer over so the video screen is away from you and the sliding ventilation cover is underneath. There are 5 6/32 by 3/4 inch Phillips screws holding the two halves of the carrying case together. Loosen them completely, but leave them in the case. It'll be easier to find them later when you reassemble. Lift the upper half of the case away from the unit. Find the small connector that attaches the fan to its power source. Disconnect it. Remove the fan assembly and place it aside for the time being. Remove the AC power cord from the compartment on the rear of the carrying case. Lift the power cord compartment slightly and carefully push it back. The right side door hinge is slightly shorter than the left side. Swing the right side up until the hinge is clear, then remove the door entirely. You'll now be ready to lift the chassis out of the case. Make sure you have enough space on your workbench to put the chassis down when you separate it from the case. Place your right hand under the chassis and your left fingers under the chassis. Try not to put any pressure on the logic board. When you lift the assembly out of the carrying case, you'll also have to lift out the power cord compartment along with it, since the wiring is still connected inside. Carefully lift the chassis and the power cord compartment together. Be sure the power cord compartment lifts out freely with the chassis. This section will show you how to remove the logic board from the chassis. If you look under the large logic board, you'll see the RAM board connected to it. This procedure will show you how to remove the whole CPU RAM board assembly. Turn the chassis so that the monitor is facing you. At this point, you could take a shortcut and disassemble the disk drives without removing the logic board. However, it'll be easier to show you drive assembly with the logic board out of the way later in this tape. In order to remove the video monitor, you must remove the logic board first. It's held in by screws which can only be reached after the board is off. Notice there's a specially designed bracket that covers the brightness and contrast controls. It's secured to the top two screws on the front of the video monitor assembly. Remove the two screws holding the bracket, then remove the bracket. Notice the position the grounding braid is in. You'll have to return it to this position when you reassemble. Reattach the two screws to the front of the video monitor assembly. Be very careful with this step. If you do move or reposition any parts, you could misalign the video monitor. You can now see 4 6/32 screws, 2 on the left side of the logic board and 2 on the bracket holding the logic board to the chassis. Remove the 2 right-hand screws. At this point, you must make a decision. If you're only removing the logic board to get to one of the other modules, you can skip ahead and remove the 2 left-hand screws. We'll show you how to do that in a minute. However, if you're replacing the logic board, you'll leave the bracket connected to the chassis. We'll show you how to do that now. Gently lift the right edge of the large copper-clad mylar shield that covers the logic board. Be careful not to rip the shield where it connects to the board. Replace the 2 right-hand screws that you just removed. To the left of these screws are 2 other screws which hold the logic board to its bracket. These two screws have nylon insulating washers on the top and bottom sides of the board. Don't lose any of these 4 washers. After you've removed the screws and top washers, lift the right end of the logic board and carefully retrieve the 2 washers that separate the logic board from its bracket. Place them with their screws somewhere on your bench where you can identify them later. Save these washers. Now you can remove the 2 screws on the left side of the board. First, remove the ground lug on the upper left. Then remove the lower left-hand screw. Tilt the front of the logic board slightly as we're doing here. Find the video harness connector. It's located to the right of the reset switch. Make a note that the wires to the video harness connector come off toward the inside of the board. Remove this connector. Continue to tilt the logic board up until it's perpendicular to the chassis. The video contrast and brightness controls should be pointing straight up. Take a moment to notice where all of the connectors to the board are and what the orientation is of those connectors. You might want to write down their positions. There are 3 connectors you'll be concerned with right now: the DC harness connector, the disc harness connector, and the external video plug. At the extreme lower left corner of the logic board is the DC harness connector. It isn't keyed, so it would be a good idea to mark it with a felt-tipped marker that matches the connector and the board. Remove this connector. The disc harness connector is also on the lower left corner of the logic board to the right of the DC harness connector. Notice that this connector is not keyed. The red stripe on the harness must go toward the middle of the board. You might want to make a note to yourself about its orientation. Grip the connector and carefully disconnect it. Be sure not to bend any pins. If you do, bend them back carefully. The external video plug is located on the front of the logic board. Remove this plug only if you're replacing the logic board. You're now ready to remove the logic board from the chassis. But before you do, have an anti-static surface ready. We're using cardboard here. Remove the logic board assembly and place it on the anti-static surface. Notice that the logic board consists of the main CPU board, covered and attached to the copper mylar, and the smaller piggyback RAM board, covered with a sheet of mylar insulation. Never place the logic board down onto the copper mylar. It may puncture it. Remove the mylar insulator on the RAM board. The RAM board is held to the CPU board by its connector and 2 standoffs which have been snapped in place. First, unsnap the standoffs carefully, being careful not to put undue stress on the board or its connector. Then carefully separate the pins of the connector. Inspect both boards for any obvious faulty conditions, and of course treat the boards with care. Don't let the copper-clad mylar shield fall loose, or don't put any pressure on the shield. The pins on the components could puncture the shield and short the board. At this point, you can disassemble either the disk drive assembly or the video power supply assembly, whichever needs further work. We'll show you both procedures, but you don't normally have to disassemble both modules. This section will show you how to remove the video monitor and power supply assembly. It should follow the removal of the logic board, since there are screws under the logic board which must be removed. Be sure the chassis assembly is still turned upside down from its normal operating position, but turn it so the monitor is facing away from you. Turn the whole chassis assembly so the video monitor is face down. Under the monitor, to the left, is a strap that's held in place with an 832 screw. Remove this screw. Turn the chassis so the power supply is facing you. Notice that there are 3 keyed power supply connectors on the power supply. 2 are close together, near you. The other is inside, above the filter capacitors. Disconnect the one on the inside of the board first. Then disconnect the 2 that are near each other. One of these has 2 pins, the other 12. The 12-pin connector may be seated quite firmly. Use firm but gentle pressure on the connector itself to pull it out. Don't pull on the wires. On the upper rear corner of the power supply, next to the fuse, is a 632 by half-inch screw holding the power supply ground lug and the grounding jumper under the board. Remove the screw and the ground lug. Turn the chassis back down so the video monitor is facing away from you. Lift the disk drive harness away from the chassis. There are 4 632 by 3/8 Phillips screws which hold the video monitor to the chassis. Don't misplace or misuse these screws. Their length is critical. Later, when you're reassembling, you could short-circuit the power supply with an incorrect size screw here. Remove these 4 screws. Set them aside where you'll find them later. Hold the chassis with your right hand and the logic board bracket with your left, and lift the whole assembly away from the video monitor. Place the video monitor on its side with the power supply board facing up. There should be 4 more 632 by 3/8 screws holding the power supply to the monitor chassis. 3 are on the corners and 1 is in the middle section of the board. Remove these 4 screws. Keep the star washers with them. You'll have to use them later when you reassemble. This section will show you how to disassemble the 2 disk drives. Be sure the chassis is positioned upside down as we show here. On the right of each drive is the disk harness. Notice that the disk harness has a stripe on the right edge. Detach these 2 connectors. On the left of each drive is the keyed DC harness. Detach these 2 connectors. 2 latches lock the disk drive assembly to the chassis. Press on the tip of the latch with a screwdriver to release it. Carefully lift the chassis from left to right until it's clear of the drive assembly. Since the computer has been turned upside down, remember drive B is on the top of drive A. There are 4 632 by 1/2 inch screws holding each drive into the drive housing. Remove the 4 upper screws that hold drive B in place. Carefully lift drive B straight up and out of the drive housing. Remove drive A by first removing the screws on one side, then turn the chassis on end and remove the other 2 screws. Then lift drive A out of the housing. Remember to mark or label each drive so you can put the correct drive back into the correct position later. Drive A can be identified by a jumper at positions HM and DS1 next to edge connector J1. Drive A also has a resistor on socket R21. Drive B has a jumper at positions HM and DS2 next to edge connector J1 and no resistor in socket R21. Remove the shield from the disk drive housing. Notice there are 4 plastic guide brackets for the drives. Remove these brackets. This section will show you how to take apart the power switch assembly. The power switch assembly is located on the right corner of the chassis. Push the switch forward to free it from the chassis. When you're doing this, carefully guide the switch wires through the notch in the switch mounting to free them. Notice the color coding of the wires going to the switch assembly. Write down their positions before you disconnect them. After you've made sure you can reattach the proper colored wires to the proper terminals, disconnect the wire harness from the power switch. You don't have to disconnect the wiring harness from the switch to change the lamp inside the switch. Pull off the plastic push button on the front of the switch. Pull forward the metal slide latch inside the switch housing to release the bulb. Replace the bulb with a 12-volt number 73 lamp. This procedure could be done without removing the chassis from the carrying case. This section will show you how to remove the power panel. As you detach wires from the power panel harness, keep track of where they're connected. When you reassemble, it'll make your job easier. Notice that there's a large ground lug with 2 cables joining a slip-on lug. Remove this connector. Pull off the 2 slip-on lugs on the back of the power cord connector. Pull off the 2 slip-on lugs on the back of the voltage selector. If you have to replace the entire power panel, these 4 screws hold it to the molded frame. This section will show you how to remove the fan assembly and change the fan filter. From time to time, it may be necessary to clean or change this filter. Slide the fan cover all the way back until you meet some resistance. Then press the inside of the cover up slightly until the plastic bends just enough to allow the cover to slide out the rest of the way. Pull off the filter and either replace it or clean it. Notice that it was held in place by the 4 molded tabs on the underside of the housing. The fan itself can be removed from the housing by removing these 4 screws. Some machines will have clips rather than nuts. At this point, we've completed disassembly of the Osborne Executive. Reassembly should also be performed in a specific order. We'll review that order now, then get into the details for each module. We'll start with the fan assembly, then the power panel, the power switch, the disk drives, the video monitor and power supply, the logic board, the bezel and main chassis, and finally the keyboard. This section will show you how to assemble the fan module. First, replace the 4 screws holding the fan to the molded plastic fan housing. Be sure the DC harness is on the side of the fan that will face into the computer. Replace the filter by putting it in position over the molded housing. If you press the filter onto the molded tabs with a small nut driver and twist, the filter will snug itself around those tabs. Slide the fan cover into the track on the housing. When you meet resistance, bend the cover slightly to clear the tabs under it. Then slide the cover all the way back into position. This section will show you how to assemble the power panel module. Check your notes and reattach the slip-on lugs to the correct pins on the voltage selector switch. Reattach the correct slip-on lugs to the back of the power cord connector. Reattach the double-wire ground lug connector. Since the power switch lamp has been replaced already and the plastic push button is on the front of the assembly, you can connect the wire harness to the terminals on the back of the power switch. Check your notes if necessary. Be sure you connect the correct colored wire to the correct terminal. If you have any doubts, check the Executive Service Manual. Carefully guide the switch wires through the notch on the power switch mounting bracket. Finally, push the switch assembly back into the chassis. This section will show you the correct procedures for reassembling the disk drives. Install the 4 plastic guide brackets to the inside of the drive housing. If you have to reinstall the shield, do it now. Place the shield over the drive housing like this. Align the notches in the shield with the notches in the housing. The edge of the shield should match the edge of the housing, as we have done here. Position the housing on your bench so the large cutout is facing away from you. Find disk drive A. Remember, it has jumpers at positions HM and DS1 next to edge connector J1. Drive A also has a resistor on socket R21. With the strobe wheel facing up, align the notches on the sides of the drive with the guide brackets in the housing. Carefully insert drive A straight down into the housing. Use the screws you removed during disassembly. Their length is critical. Longer screws can damage the disk drive. You may have to move the drive slightly to align the holes in the shield as you're starting them. Find drive B. It has jumpers at positions HM and DS2 next to the edge connector. Again, with the strobe wheel facing up, carefully insert it above drive A in the drive housing. This is a critical step. Don't over-tighten these screws. Over-tightening could cause the disk drive housing to warp. They should be tightened only until they're firmly seated. Be sure you don't use too much pressure to seat these screws. These 2 latches lock the disk drive assembly to the chassis. Turn the chassis upside down. With the drive doors facing you, carefully align the notches in the chassis assembly with the latches on the drive housing and be sure they latch completely. Turn the chassis over with the disk drive facing away from you. Find the disk drive and the DC input harnesses. The disk drive harness is the flat ribbon cable with a stripe on the right edge. Reattach the drive DC input connectors to the correct drives. They go on the far right connector on both drives. The small connector for the fan motor goes toward the top. Reattach the drive harness connectors to the correct drives. They go to the far right connector on both drives. Notice that the ribbon cable serves as a holder for the DC harness. This section will show you how to assemble the video monitor and power supply. Be sure the chassis is in its upside-down position with the disk drive doors facing away from you. Find the monitor assembly and place it on its left side with the power supply standoffs facing up. Place the power supply on these standoffs with the large connector toward you. Install 4 632 by 1/2 inch Phillips screws into the standoffs in the position we show here. Leave the lower left hole empty for now. The 5th screw holds the ground wire lug and should be installed after the monitor power supply assembly is placed in the chassis. This empty hole should have a ground symbol next to it. Make sure the chassis is positioned so the power supply board is on the side opposite the disk drives. Slide the assembly into the chassis while you guide the monitor cable through the chassis cutout. Find the 4 632 by 3/8 Phillips screws that you had earlier labeled video monitor. Remember, you must use these 3/8 screws. Anything longer might cause a short circuit when the power is turned on. Install these screws through the chassis into the monitor assembly frame. Don't over-tighten them, but be sure they're snug. Find the last 632 by 1/2 inch screw for the power supply board. Slip the power supply ground wire lug and the grounding jumper under the board and use this screw to secure the power supply to the upper rear of the board. Be sure you make a good ground connection. The correct position for mounting it is located next to the fuse on the board. Turn the chassis so the video monitor is face down. Reattach the strap to the monitor shield with the 832 screw. Tighten the screw carefully so you don't strip the hole in the video monitor shield. Reconnect the connector that mates to the interior of the power supply board. Find the other 2 power supply connectors at the top of the board. One has 2 pins, the other 12. They're both keyed connectors, so they can only connect in one direction. Connect both of these connectors to the power supply. Be careful when you're connecting the 2-pin harness. Since the harness is short, it's easy to pull the lugs off of the power switch on the other end. Turn the chassis so the video screen is facing away from you. Reposition the disk drive harness under the clip on the chassis. This section will show you the correct way of assembling the logic board onto the chassis. Be sure the chassis assembly is in the upside-down position with the video monitor screen facing you. If you're replacing the logic board, we'll now show you how to attach its bracket. If you've simply removed the logic board to get to the video monitor and power supply, the bracket should still be attached to the logic board. Place the logic board and the chassis bracket on an anti-static surface like the cardboard we show here. The video contrast and brightness control should be facing toward you. Gently lift the mylar copper shield and attach the board to the bracket using the inner holes on the board. Be sure there are nylon washers above and below the board when you're installing these 2 screws. Be sure the bracket does not touch the pins of the ICs on the logic board. Find the smaller RAM board. Carefully align the pins of the RAM connector with their mates on the main logic board. Join these pins with firm but gentle pressure. Be careful that you match the connector properly and you don't bend any pins. Snap the 2 standoffs into the holes on the RAM board. The holes in the mylar insulating sheet will slip over the standoffs. Place the logic board perpendicular to the chassis with the component side facing you. The video contrast and brightness control shafts should be pointing straight up. Find the disc harness connector. Notice that it isn't keyed. However, the red stripe on the harness must go to the right when you connect this connector. Be sure you don't bend any pins and carefully install the disc harness to the connector located on the lower left corner of the logic board. It's to the right of the DC harness connector. Find the DC harness connector that matches it. Install it to the connector on the extreme lower left of the logic board so that the marks you made earlier match. Carefully tilt the logic board down onto its chassis mounting brackets. Now find the video harness connector. Lift the front edge of the logic board and install this connector. Find the bracket that attaches to the front of the video monitor assembly and the carrying case. Remove the top two screws on the video monitor assembly and install this bracket as we show here using those same two screws. Be careful that you don't move any of the parts of the video monitor assembly when you do this, because movement might cause misalignment of the video display. Also, be sure the braided grounding strap from the logic board is in front of the bracket. It'll be used later to ground the shielding on the bezel. Install the two screws on the left side. Be sure the tabs on the copper mylar shield curl under the screws. The rear left screw holds the ground wire lug. Be sure to attach this lug when you're installing this screw. Remember to use star washers. Install the screws on the right side holding down the shield and the bracket. Remember, don't ever put pressure on the mylar copper shield. The pins below can puncture the mylar and short out the board. Finally, install the external video plug on the front edge of the board. It's keyed and it's located between the contrast control and the reset switch. This section will show you the proper way to install the chassis into the carrying case and to mount the bezel to the computer. Remember, the interior of the case is coated with a special metallic paint. Don't scratch this paint. Be sure the chassis assembly is still in the upside-down position. However, rotate it so the video monitor is facing away from you. Find the top half of the carrying case. It's the half with the ventilation slots. Position it upside down on your work surface with the latches away from you. Place your left fingers under the chassis. Your right hand should hold the chassis and the power cord compartment. Carefully lift the chassis into the top half of the carrying case. Be sure that the AC power cord compartment goes freely into the carrying case. Also, be sure you don't pinch, trap, or rip cable harnesses when you're installing the chassis into the case. You might want to take a careful look at areas where the harnesses are close to the case to see that they're positioned well before going any further. Align the screw holes in the chassis with the 5 screw holes on the standoffs in the carrying case. Slide the carrying handle plate and fan assembly into the lower part of the case. Be sure that the broad area of the plate is below the handle. Connect the power harness for the fan. This is a keyed connector, so it will only connect one way. Slide the hinges of the power compartment door into their cutouts on the power panel compartment, as we show here. Place the lower half of the case onto the chassis assembly. Be sure the AC power compartment, the carrying handle plate, and the upper and lower halves of the case align properly. The 5 screws should still be in the case from disassembly. As you're tightening each screw, press the 2 halves of the case together to seat it. If you try to use the tightening action of the screws themselves, there's a danger of stripping the threaded inserts in the case. And don't over-tighten these screws. Tighten them only until they're secure. Place the power cord into its compartment. Carefully turn the whole unit over so the sliding ventilation cover is on the top with the video monitor screen facing you. Be sure the unused screw hole on the bracket at the front of the video monitor is aligned with the mounting hole in the front of the carrying case. Be sure the keyboard cable latches are in the closed position before you install the bezel. Find the bezel and hold it near the carrying case latch cutouts. Carefully slide it into the chassis. As you slide it in, tilt it up slightly to prevent the diskette holder insert from bending any of the pins on the large connector inside on the logic board. Find the 5 632 by 1/2 inch Phillips screws and secure the bezel to the front of the chassis. As with the carrying case, seat the bezel firmly with hand pressure as you tighten the screws. Don't over-tighten. Tighten them only until they're secure. Carefully push the 2 video control knobs onto their shafts. This section will show you how to reassemble the keyboard. Be sure you have a pad, carpet, or other soft material on your work surface when you're working with the keyboard. Place the keyboard bezel onto this pad with the standoffs facing up toward you. Align the key switch array face down with the cutouts on the keyboard bezel. Find 4 832 Phillips screws and install 3 of them to secure the keyboard to the standoffs. Locate pin 1 of the keyboard connection. You can do this easily by repositioning the keyboard connector to the upper right. Facing the underside of the keyboard, pin 1 is in the upper right corner. Pin 1 may also have a dot next to it. Be careful not to bend any pins. If you do, carefully bend them back into position. Reattach the ground lug with the 4th 832 screw. If the harness configuration doesn't exactly match ours, check your service manual. Feed the keyboard cable through the slot, leaving only about an inch of straight cable exposed ahead of the coiling. Lower the keyboard case onto the keyboard in bezel assembly so the case and bezel are flush. When it's aligned correctly, it'll drop into place. The 4 632 by half-inch screws should be in their holes in the keyboard case. Tighten these to secure the keyboard assembly. Turn the keyboard face up. Connect the keyboard cable to the keyboard connection below the video monitor screen. As you face the screen, the cable connects from the left. This completes the video presentation on assembly and disassembly. Be sure you test the computer for full operation before returning it to your customer. Procedures for video monitor and disk drive alignment are available on another Osborne tape. Thank you very much for your time.